Hey guys, tonight we begin with the grand gruesome finale of England's most infamous monarch, King Henry VIII. Forget the athletic king who changed religion to change wives. We're joining him in his twilight years, bloated, paranoid, in constant agony, and surrounded by doctors whose cures were arguably worse than his diseases. This is the story of how a titan of history faced his final, losing battle against his own decaying body. Spoiler alert. Immortality isn't on the menu, but infected leg ulcers, morbid obesity, and Tudor medicine's greatest hits definitely are. Enjoy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. He survived decades as King Henry VIII. He broke with Rome, executed wives, became supreme head of the church, and generally terrified everyone. Now comes the final boss level, his own decaying body. Welcome to the grand, gruesome finale of England's most infamous monarch. Okay, let's start the autopsy of his final years. It's the 1,540 seconds. The dashing, athletic Prince Henry, vaguely remembered being, is long gone, buried under decades of royal feasting, political stress, and sheer, unadulterated ego. He is no longer the athletic young stud who charmed the court. He has become substantial, monumental even. He is now spectacularly, monumentally obese. Let's not mince words here. We're talking a waistline stretching past 54 inches. Measurements taken from his surviving armor suggest he's pushing 400 pounds. His old suits of armor wouldn't even fit his leg now. They stand in the tower, gleaming metal ghosts of the man he used to be, while he requires increasingly complex engineering just to get dressed. The man who once vaulted into saddles and danced all night has become a prisoner in his own expanding kingdom of flesh. The struggle is real and deeply undignified. His mobility is shot. Forget strolling majestically through his palaces. He now navigates his world with the grace of a beached whale. Walking is an ordeal. Stairs are a military campaign. He needs mechanical contraptions, engines, they politely call them, winches and cranes, basically, just to get him upstairs to his royal bedchamber. Or, failing that, teams of sweating servants strain to carry his royal bulk in a reinforced chair. Imagine the sheer humiliation. The king, the supreme head of the church, having to be hoisted around like a particularly valuable piece of cargo. The man who once jousted for fun, who loved hunting and hawking, can now barely walk. He might still occasionally ride a horse, lowered onto a specially bred, tragically sturdy mount, but the days of athletic prowess are a distant, mocking memory. This forced inactivity, combined with his legendary appetite feasts featuring dozens of courses washed down with gallons of ale were still standard, creates a vicious cycle. Less movement means more weight gain, which means even less movement. Congratulations, Henry. He's achieved a level of sedentary majesty previously unknown to English monarchs. And all this immobility, this steady, relentless physical decline, must be doing wonders for his famously sunny disposition. He was never known for his patience, even when he was fit and healthy. Now, trapped in a body that refuses to cooperate, surrounded by pain and frustration, his temper, already legendary, likely reaches new, terrifying heights. The once charismatic king is curdling into a bloated, immobile, and perpetually furious old man. His court walks on eggshells, listening for the telltale rumble of his approach, carried perhaps by 6 straining grooms, and praying they don't say the wrong thing when he finally arrives, wheezing and simmering with royal rage. This isn't just a physical decline, it's the slow, grotesque unraveling of an icon, and the worst part? His legs are starting to hurt. A lot. His sheer size wasn't Henry's only problem. It wasn't even the most disgusting one. Meet his true nemesis, the constant, agonizing companion of his final years, the chronic, weeping, foul-smelling ulcers on his legs. These weren't just a few minor sores. These were deep, open, suppurating wounds, likely varicose ulcers aggravated by his immense weight and poor circulation, or perhaps old jousting injuries that had simply refused to heal and festered for decades. They were his personal, internal battlefield, and he was losing spectacularly. Imagine the scene: the King of England, supreme head of the church, defender of the faith, unable to stand without excruciating pain because his own legs are literally rotting beneath him. The ulcers would flare up, becoming inflamed, swollen, and leaking pus and foul fluids. The pain must have been immense, a constant throbbing agony that overshadowed every aspect of his life. Contemporary accounts depict him as increasingly irritable, short-tempered, and prone to rages, and it's not hard to see why. Living with chronic, debilitating pain doesn't exactly foster a sunny disposition, especially when you're also morbidly obese and surrounded by people you suspect are trying to steal your job, or possibly just waiting for you to die. And then there was the smell. Let's not be delicate about this. Infected, weeping ulcers, especially in an era before antibiotics and basic hygiene, produced a stench, a foul, sweet, unmistakable odor of decay. This smell likely clung to the king, permeating the heavy velvets and furs he wore, announcing his presence before he even entered a room. His terrified courtiers, naturally, had to pretend not to notice. Imagine the level of sycophantic self-control required to stand near the king, exchanging pleasantries about the weather, while trying desperately not to gag from the smell of his slowly decaying legs. It adds a whole new layer of grim reality to the glamour of the Tudor court. Breathing through your mouth probably became a vital survival skill for anyone in Henry's inner circle. The ulcers weren't just painful and smelly, they were politically inconvenient. They frequently left him bedridden, unable to attend council meetings or public functions. His physical weakness became a symbol of his declining power, fueling the ambitions of the factions circling the throne. Every time he was incapacitated by pain, the Seymours and the Howards would scheme a little harder, positioning themselves for the inevitable power vacuum. His personal agony was inseparable from the political instability of his final years. The king wasn't just sick, his sickness was shaking the kingdom. So Henry is a mountain of royal misery, obese, immobile, and smelling faintly of decaying leg. What does the pinnacle of 16th century medical science offer this suffering monarch? Congratulations. It offers exactly the same brand of enthusiastic, theory-driven torture that any common peasant would receive, only with more expensive robes and significantly higher stakes if things go wrong. His learned physicians, the best that Oxford and Cambridge could produce, gather around the groaning king. They consult their four humours cheat sheets. Is the king flushed and angry? Clearly too much hot, aggressive blood. Is he bloated and feverish? A corruption of the humours requiring immediate and violent expulsion. Their solution, inevitably, involves trying to rebalance the king by forcibly removing fluids he probably desperately needs. Bloodletting is a regular event in the royal chambers. Picture the scene: the king, already weakened and possibly anemic, having a vein opened while his doctors watch the blood drip into a bowl, sagely nodding and discussing its colour and consistency. They believe they are releasing the peccant humours, the very essence of his illness and bad temper. What they are actually doing is making a sick, overweight man even weaker and more prone to infection. But it looks scientific, involves sharp objects, and provides a tangible result: a bowl of royal blood. So everyone pretends it's working splendidly. And if letting blood out isn't enough, there's always the other end. Purging is another favourite. Henry is regularly dosed with powerful laxatives and emetics, designed to cleanse his system with spectacular, gut-wrenching efficiency. The goal is to expel the corrupt humours, regardless of the cost to the king's dignity or hydration levels. One can only imagine the state of the royal commode after such treatments. But the true masterpiece of Tudor medical intervention is reserved for his infamous leg ulcers. You thought the disease was bad? Wait until you see the cure. The royal surgeons, men whose primary qualification is a strong stomach and a willingness to inflict pain in the name of healing, set to work with gusto. The standard ulcer care involves regular cleansing. This isn't a gentle dabbing with antiseptic. Oh no. This means lancing the swollen, pus-filled sores to release the bad humours, again, and then often scraping away the dead and dying flesh, sometimes right down to the bone. All of this, naturally, without anaesthesia. Henry, being Henry, probably roars and curses throughout the procedure, possibly even offering helpful suggestions to the terrified surgeon holding the knife. After the wound has been sufficiently brutalized, it's time for the poultices and ointments. These aren't soothing antibacterial creams. They are bizarre concoctions based on folklore, humoral theory, and sheer guesswork. They might contain anything from harmless herbs to actively harmful substances like lead or mercury compounds. Sometimes, to stop the bleeding or burn out the corruption, the surgeons might even resort to cauterization, pressing a red-hot iron against the open wound. The sizzle and smell of the king's own burning flesh must have been a delightful addition to the royal ambience. Through all this, Henry endures. He submits to the bleeding, the purging, the scraping, the burning, because what choice does he have? This is medicine. This is the best science has to offer. His learned doctors assure him it's all necessary, all part of the grand plan to rebalance his royal humours. He, the man who defied the Pope, is utterly powerless against the confident incompetence of his own physicians. They are fighting his illness with the medical equivalent of hitting a complex machine with a very large, very dirty hammer. And the machine is starting to break down. Now, you might think being king meant Henry could just sit back and endure whatever bizarre treatments his physicians prescribed. But you'd be forgetting one crucial aspect of his personality. Henry VIII believed he was the smartest man in any room on any topic. Religion? Obviously. Politics? Naturally. War? Of course. And, as his health failed, he also developed a keen and deeply dangerous personal interest in medicine. He wasn't just a patient, he was the head consultant, chief pharmacist, and lead researcher on the agonizing project of his own decaying body. This wasn't just a casual hobby. Henry owned medical texts. He corresponded with physicians across Europe. He had his own collection of herbs, minerals, and questionable substances. He fancied himself not just a king, but a learned Renaissance man, a dabbler in the scientific arts. And when your own doctors seem incapable of fixing your rotting legs or your crippling pain, what's a divinely appointed monarch to do? DIY medicine, of course. He concocted his own remedies, convinced that his royal insight could succeed where mere professionals had failed. Imagine the scene. Henry, too large to move easily, propped up with pillows, directing his apothecaries and physicians like a particularly demanding chef in a very gruesome kitchen. "More powdered pearl in that plaster," he might bellow. "And fetch me the oil of scorpion." The Greek text says it counteracts putrefaction. He would create elaborate ointments and plasters based on his own reading of ancient authorities, or perhaps just a particularly vivid fever dream. His personal recipes often featured fantastically expensive ingredients, like ground-up pearls or other precious stones, because the logic was simple. Expensive disease requires expensive cure. Plus, it was a good way to show off that he could afford to literally rub jewels into his open wounds. But his experiments weren't just limited to bling. He was also a man of his time, and his time loved its heavy metals. He likely dabbled with compounds containing lead and mercury, the rock stars of the Tudor pharmacy, believed to be powerful agents against everything from skin complaints to syphilis. He might have insisted on adding a dash of mercury to his leg poultices, hoping its fearsome power would kill the corruption. oblivious to the fact that it might also be slowly poisoning him through his open sores. And his doctors? What could they do? You can picture them, standing by, nodding politely, their faces pale with terror. Here is the King of England, supreme head of the church, a man who signs death, warrants before breakfast, enthusiastically prescribing himself treatments that make their own questionable methods look like sensible precautions. Do you tell the king that his brilliant pearl and lead plaster is useless and possibly toxic? Do you suggest that maybe rubbing mercury into an open wound isn't the best idea? Not if you value your continued employment, or indeed your head. So, the doctor's dilemma was acute. They had to pretend these royal recipes were brilliant. They would apply the king's self-designed goo with great ceremony, praising His Majesty's unparalleled medical genius, while probably praying that it didn't immediately make things worse. They were caught between their, admittedly terrible, medical training and the absolute necessity of flattering the ego of a dying tyrant. It adds another layer of dark absurdity to Henry's final years. He wasn't just being tormented by his doctors, he was actively participating in, and possibly directing, his own medical torture, convinced he knew best. Dr. Henry's home remedies were likely just another nail in his rapidly sealing coffin, administered with a forced smile by the most terrified medical team in history. A king trapped in a mountain of decaying flesh, suffering from constant grinding physical pain. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, it turns out. Henry VIII's legendary charisma had always been underpinned by an equally legendary ego and temper. Now, with his body betraying him daily, that temper curdled into something darker, more volatile, and infinitely more dangerous for everyone around him. His famous irritability became his defining characteristic. The man who once charmed ambassadors and jousted for hours now simmered with a perpetual, low-grade fury, punctuated by terrifying explosions of rage. The source wasn't just political frustration, it was the relentless agony from his ulcerated legs, the humiliation of his immobility, and the sheer existential dread of a man confronting his own mortality. It's hard to be magnanimous when your legs feel like they're on fire and you need a crane to get out of bed. This physical misery bled directly into his mental state. Paranoia, always a useful tool for a Tudor monarch, became an obsession. He saw plots everywhere. A minor disagreement over policy wasn't just a difference of opinion, it was potential treason. A courtier whispering in a corner wasn't just gossiping, they were scheming. His reign became more tyrannical, marked by increased suspicion and waves of arrests and executions. Remember Catherine Howard? Executed in 1492 for teenage indiscretions. Thomas Cromwell? Executed partly for arranging a bad marriage. The threshold for incurring royal wrath plummeted as his health declined. His pain became everyone's problem. The court life surrounding the aging king transformed into a masterclass in fear management. Courtiers learned to walk on eggshells, constantly monitoring the king's mood, deciphering his groans, trying to predict the next eruption. Laughter became strained, compliments became desperate, silence became the safest option. You can imagine the tension in the council chamber. Advisors presenting reports, desperately trying to phrase bad news in a way that wouldn't trigger a royal meltdown potentially involving accusations of heresy or immediate imprisonment. Making eye contact was probably a high-risk activity. Offering unsolicited advice? Suicidal. Even choosing your outfit could be dangerous. Wear the wrong color on a day when the king's leg was particularly bad, and you might find yourself suddenly out of favor, or worse. The atmosphere wasn't just tense, it was toxic, fueled by the king's suffering and the courtier's naked terror. Henry, in his final years, wasn't just ruling England, he was presiding over a court held hostage by his own agony and the dark, suspicious corners of his increasingly troubled mind. Henry wasn't just battling his own body, he was also presiding over a viper's nest of ambition, and religious backstabbing. While the king groaned in his chambers, his court was divided into two main teams, constantly trying to trip each other up. The conservative, Catholic-leaning faction, led by ruthless traditionalists like Bishop Stephen Gardiner, and the reformist, Protestant-leaning group, championed by figures like the ambitious Seymour brothers, uncles to Prince Edward, and Henry's current wife, the savvy Catherine Parr. Think of it as a corporate turf war, but with higher stakes. Lose this game, and you might lose your head, not just your corner office. These factions weren't just debating theology, they were jockeying for influence over the clearly ailing king. Every decision, every appointment, every royal frown was scrutinized for signs of who was up and who was down. The Conservatives wanted to halt the Reformation, maybe even roll it back, and ensure their guys were in charge when Henry finally kicked the bucket. The Reformers wanted to push England further towards Protestantism and secure their own power base around the young Prince Edward. It was a high-stakes game of chess, played around a dying monarch's bedside, with England as the prize. And Henry? He sat at the centre, bloated, suspicious, and probably enjoying the chaos just a little bit. Even in his decline, he was a master manipulator. He played the factions off against each other, promoting one group one week, favouring the other the next. It was his way of keeping everyone off balance, ensuring no single group became powerful enough to challenge him, even in his weakness. Was Bishop Gardiner getting too big for his britches? Henry might lean towards the Seymours for a while. Were the Protestants pushing too hard? He might suddenly remember his Catholic roots and have a few heretics burned, just to keep things interesting. His paranoia, undoubtedly fueled by his constant pain and the obvious ambition swirling around him, made the court a dangerous place. One day you could be the king's favoured advisor. The next you could be facing trumped-up charges orchestrated by the rival faction who had caught the king's ear during a particularly bad leg day. Loyalty was fleeting. Survival depended on navigating the king's volatile moods and the shifting tides of factional warfare. Catherine Parr herself nearly fell victim to this, barely escaping arrest for heresy thanks to her quick thinking and Henry's massive ego. The atmosphere wasn't just political, it was poisonous. Every smile hid a calculation, every compliment a potential threat. Welcome to Faction Fight Club. The first rule is, don't trust anyone. The second rule is, definitely don't trust the boss. With the king clearly lumbering towards the final royal exit, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the perfumed air wasn't if, but when, and more importantly, who would pick up the pieces. Henry had his precious male heir, Edward VI, but Edward was just a young boy, barely old enough to grasp the concept of divine right, let alone wield it. A child king wasn't a stable succession, it was a power vacuum gift, wrapped for the most ruthless players at court. It was less a handover and more a starting gun for the next round of England's favourite blood sport, political backstabbing. Every courtier knew it. Henry's clearly failing health turned the most dangerous game in town from jousting to jockeying for position around the boy king-to-be. Forget whispering sweet nothings. The real currency now was proximity to young Edward. The factions circling the throne weren't just debating theology, they were holding auditions for the role of puppet master. Would it be the Protestant Seymours, led by Edward's ambitious uncle, eager to secure their grip on the future? Or would the conservative Catholics somehow manage a comeback, rewriting the script before the final act? Every pained groan from the king's chambers sent ripples of anxiety and strategic calculation through the court. It was less a kingdom and more a high-stakes poker game where everyone was bluffing, and the ante was England itself. And caught in the crossfire, trying to keep the game from collapsing into open warfare, was wife number 6, Catherine Parr. Her role had subtly morphed from nurse and companion to that of a tightrope walker balancing over a pit of vipers. While Henry raged against his failing body and unseen enemies, Catherine had the unenviable task of managing not just the king, but the pack of wolves gathering around his throne. She had to navigate the treacherous currents between the factions, ensure some semblance of a smooth transition, and crucially, protect the futures of the young Prince Edward and his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, whom she had skillfully brought back into the precarious orbit of royal favour. Imagine her daily performance. One moment, she's soothing the king's ego, a monumental task in itself, and supervising the gruesome rituals of his medical care. The next, she's deftly deflecting loaded theological questions designed by Bishop Gardiner to trap her into heresy. The next, she's mediating a simmering power struggle between nobles whose ambitions were as inflated as the king's waistline. She wasn't just queen consort, she was the acting chief of staff, crisis manager, and head nurse rolled into one, all while dealing with the world's most powerful, unpredictable, and rapidly decaying patient. Her survival, and arguably the fragile peace of the kingdom, rested on her sharp intellect, her careful piety, and her mastery of the subtle art of managing a tyrant's ego. While Henry fretted about securing his personal legacy, Catherine Parr was quietly, desperately trying to ensure his kingdom had a legacy worth securing at all. The year turned to 1547. Outside, England shivered through a cold January. Inside the Palace of Whitehall, the king himself was entering his final icy winter. The rapid decline, when it came, was stark. After years of slow, grotesque decay, Henry's body seemed to finally decide it had had enough. The fevers became more frequent, more intense. The infamous leg ulcers likely raged, perhaps leading to sepsis. His breathing might have grown laboured. The sheer effort of existing, of hauling his massive frame through another day, was becoming too much. The royal engine, fueled for decades by ego and roasted swans, was finally, irrevocably sputtering out. The vultures knew. You can picture the court, already a viper's nest of factional intrigue, shifting into overdrive. The whispers grew louder, the secret meetings more frequent. Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, uncle to the young Prince Edward and leader of the Protestant faction, wasn't just planning for the future, he was actively shaping it. He knew that whoever controlled the narrative of the king's death, and controlled the young prince immediately afterward, would control England. The Conservatives, led by Gardiner, were equally aware of the stakes. The final, frantic power plays began around the king's deathbed, even before he was actually dead. The king himself, drifting in and out of consciousness, plagued by fever and pain, was likely only dimly aware of the scheming happening just outside his chamber door. Or perhaps he knew exactly what was going on, and simply lacked the strength or the will to stop it. The man who had once micromanaged every aspect of his kingdom was now reduced to the dying centerpiece of his own succession crisis. His advisors weren't asking for his orders anymore. They were quietly dividing up his kingdom while checking his pulse. It was the ultimate indignity for a monarch obsessed with control, losing control not just of his body, but of his own political legacy before he'd even finished creating it. The beginning of the end wasn't just a physical decline, it was the final, frantic unraveling of the world Henry had built. The king is drifting. The immense, pain-racked body that housed England's most volatile ego is finally succumbing to its own internal rebellion. Outside the chamber doors, Seymour and his faction are busy rearranging the kingdom's furniture, but inside, the atmosphere grows stiller, heavier. Henry, floating in and out of consciousness, occasionally lucid, mostly lost in fever dreams, is approaching the final checkout. And even for a man who tore down the authority of the Pope, there are certain final protocols to observe. It's time to call the Archbishop. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer is summoned. The very same Cranmer who had obliged Henry by annulling his first marriage, validating the second, presiding over the break with Rome, and generally acting as the king's spiritual wingman through decades of religious and marital chaos. Cranmer probably approaches the royal bedchamber with a certain amount of trepidation. Henry in his prime was terrifying enough. A dying Henry, possibly hallucinating and definitely in agony, is a theological minefield. What does one say to the man who declared himself God's representative in England? As he prepares to meet the actual CEO, Cranmer arrives at the bedside. Henry is barely conscious, his breathing shallow, his great bulk still beneath the heavy covers. The scene is likely hushed, lit by flickering candlelight, smelling of sickness and fear. Does Henry recognize him? Accounts, as always, differ, coloured by the religious politics of those who wrote them. Some say the king is too far gone, unresponsive. Others claim a moment of final, lucid connection. One popular, though possibly embellished, story tells of Cranmer asking the king to give some sign that he died trusting in Christ. Henry, unable to speak, supposedly reaches out and squeezes Cranmer's hand. A tiny gesture perhaps, but enough for the reformers to claim their champion died a true believer, or at least conscious enough to perform a hand squeeze on cue. Whatever the state of Henry's soul, Cranmer performs his duty. The last rites are administered, prayers are murmured. The man who had sent so many others to their deaths, wives, advisors, monks, heretics, now receives the final benediction himself. It's a moment thick with irony. Henry, who had spent his life bending religion to his will, now submits to its final, quiet ritual. He receives the church's blessing, even if it's his version of the church, administered by his archbishop. Even on his deathbed, Henry VIII manages to have it both ways. His final moments are likely quiet, an anticlimactic fading away rather than a dramatic final speech. The great roar that had dominated England for nearly 4 decades subsides into silence. The man who had seemed larger than life, a force of nature wrapped in royal robes, simply stops. The doctors pronounce him dead. The courtiers exchange nervous glances, and outside the chamber door, the carefully orchestrated plan to keep his death a secret clicks into motion. The king is gone, but the show, as always, must go on, especially when there's a 9-year-old heir and a kingdom up for grabs. He finally expired on the 28th of January 1547. The great beast was still, but the show must go on. Or rather, the show must be paused, strategically, until the stage managers have everything perfectly arranged. Officially, Henry isn't dead. He's just very unwell, indisposed, resting his royal eyes, definitely not decomposing in the increasingly stuffy royal bedchamber. The cover-up begins immediately. Seymour and his cronies effectively lock down the palace. News of the king's death is kept secret for several days. Why? Because announcing the death of a king without having your ducks firmly in a row is how civil wars start, and Seymour intends to be the one holding all the ducks. Imagine the bizarre, tense atmosphere inside Whitehall. A small, select group knows the king is dead. They have to go about their business, pretending everything is normal, while carrying the biggest secret in the kingdom. They probably hold council meetings to discuss the king's recovery. They issue orders in his name. Doctors continue to emerge from the royal chambers, looking grave but hopeful. It's a masterpiece of political theatre, performed around a corpse. Outside the inner circle, the court must be buzzing with frantic whispers. Everyone knows something is up. The guards are jumpier. Certain nobles are suddenly very busy having secret meetings. But no one dares say the obvious. Asking so, is the big man dead yet? Is a question likely to get you an extended stay in the tower, regardless of the answer. So everyone plays along with the charade. They offer prayers for the king's health. They inquire politely after his condition. They act out their roles in the final, gruesome act of Henry's reign. Seymour uses these precious, secret days like a military strategist. He secures control of key locations, like the Tower of London and the Royal Treasury. He finalises the plans for the Regency Council, ensuring he will be named Lord Protector, effectively making him king in all but name. He neutralizes potential rivals, perhaps through quiet threats or promises of future favor. He is building the new government before the old one has even been officially buried. It's ruthless, efficient, and entirely necessary. Only when his position is absolutely secure, when all the pieces are in place, does Seymour allow the charade to end. On January 31st, 3 days after Henry actually died, the official announcement is finally made. The king is dead. A wave of carefully managed grief sweeps the nation, or at least the parts of it that weren't secretly relieved. Trumpets sound, bells toll, and young Edward VI is proclaimed king. Long live the 9-year-old king. The transition is seamless, orderly, exactly as Seymour planned it. It was a masterclass in political stage management, ensuring the transfer of power happened on his terms, even if it meant leaving the deceased monarch unannounced in his chambers for a bit longer than was perhaps strictly dignified. Henry VIII, who had controlled England with an iron fist for decades, found his final exit carefully stage-managed by the very men he had promoted. Even in death, the Game of Thrones continued. The king is dead. For real this time. The announcement echoes through London, met with a carefully orchestrated wave of public mourning and a palpable undercurrent of, now what? The answer arrives swiftly. Henry's meticulous plans for a balanced regency council to govern during his son's minority, ignored. Almost immediately. Edward Seymour, uncle to the new king and the man who managed the news blackout, makes his move. Through a series of deft political maneuvers that probably involved veiled threats and backroom deals, he gets himself appointed Lord Protector. Forget council rule. England now effectively has a regent, and it's him. The succession itself goes smoothly, at least on the surface. Henry's 9-year-old son is proclaimed King Edward VI, a small, pale, intensely serious boy, raised by Protestant tutors and suddenly thrust onto the throne. Congratulations, kid. Your dad just died, and now you're the divine ruler of a religiously divided kingdom teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, while your ambitious uncle holds all the real power. Have fun. Seymour, soon to be Duke of Somerset, consolidates his position quickly. The conservative faction is sidelined. The Protestant Reformation, which had stalled somewhat in Henry's paranoid later years, kicks back into high gear. It's clear that Henry's carefully crafted will, designed to ensure a balance of power after his death, is being treated less like a sacred royal command and more like a set of gentle suggestions to be disregarded at leisure. Even in death, his control is slipping. The man who thought he could command popes and princes finds his final wishes immediately undermined by the very men he trusted. It's a classic Tudor power grab, executed with ruthless efficiency before the old king's body is even cold. The boy king takes the throne, but his uncle takes the reins. The new era has begun, and it smells distinctly Protestant. With the boy king proclaimed and Seymour firmly gripping the reins of power, the messy business of actually disposing of the old king's enormous corpse could finally proceed. Henry, in one of his rare moments of sentimental clarity, or perhaps just morbid forward planning, had requested burial in St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, right next to his third wife, Jane Seymour. Jane, remember, was the one true wife, the mother of his precious male heir, the one who conveniently died before he could get bored or find fault with her. How romantic. Or maybe he just wanted to make sure he was buried near the only successful incubator he ever married, securing his legacy even in death. Preparing the body is an undertaking, in every sense of the word. Henry wasn't just kingly, he was enormous. Embalming this mountain of royal flesh is a challenge for the royal surgeons, probably requiring industrial quantities of spices and preservatives just to slow down the inevitable putrefaction. The body is then encased in a massive, lead-lined coffin, partly out of respect, partly out of necessity, Lead lining was common for royalty to contain the byproducts of decomposition during the sometimes lengthy funeral proceedings. This coffin is reportedly so heavy it requires a small army of straining pallbearers just to budget. The funeral procession from London to Windsor is a slow, ponderous affair. Days of solemn pageantry, black cloth draped everywhere, bells tolling mournfully. You can imagine the scene. Nobles trying to look appropriately grief-stricken while secretly calculating their next political move under the new regime, commoners lining the roads out of a mixture of respect, fear, and morbid curiosity to see the final journey of the larger-than-life tyrant. It's the final performance of Henry's reign, even if the star is conspicuously inanimate. And then comes the gruesome detail, the final, undignified footnote whispered about in chronicles, adding a touch of grotesque farce to the solemn occasion. According to some accounts, during an overnight stop on the journey to Windsor, the immense pressure inside the lead-lined coffin, perhaps combined with the jolting of the journey, caused it to rupture, leak. Bodily fluids reportedly seeped out onto the floor where the coffin rested, where, according to one particularly lurid version, dogs were seen licking them up before being shooed away. Is it true? Who knows? It feels too perfectly macabre, like something out of a bad historical drama. But it's exactly the kind of gothic, slightly disgusting detail that Tudor gossips adored. True or not, it serves as a final, darkly comic symbol of Henry's larger-than-life reign, ending in a messy, undignified reality. Even his corpse refused to behave with decorum. Finally, the leaking, or not coffin reaches Windsor. With great effort, it's lowered into the vault in St. George's Chapel, beside Queen Jane. The Archbishop drones on. The heralds proclaim his titles one last time. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes, lead-lined coffin to royal vault. Henry VIII, the great tyrant, the glorious king, the man who reshaped England, is finally, definitively gone. The kingdom breathes a sigh of relief, and the worms, presumably, prepare for a feast of historic proportions. So, Henry VIII is planted next to Jane Seymour, the leaking coffin hopefully now contained. The boy king is crowned, Seymour is in charge, and England moves nervously forward. But one question lingers, hanging in the air like the faint smell of decay from the royal bedchamber. What actually killed the great tyrant? This should be simple, right? A king dies, doctors note the cause, history records it. Congratulations. You've forgotten this is Tudor England, where even death refuses to be straightforward. There was no official autopsy, or at least none whose findings were made public. Maybe the council was too busy grabbing power to bother with a post-mortem. Maybe they feared what a closer look might reveal. Or maybe nobody wanted to get that up close and personal with Henry's insides after the coffin incident. Whatever the reason, we're left with a historical medical mystery, a whodunit where the victim is a 400-pound king and the suspects are numerous and nasty. Let's review the case file, shall we? Suspect number 1, sheer size. The man was morbidly obese. We're talking about a body under immense, constant strain. His heart, his joints, his entire system was likely screaming under the pressure. Obesity alone brings a shopping list of potential fatal complications, from heart failure to respiratory problems. Henry's body was a ticking time bomb purely due to its scale. Suspect number 2, the infamous leg ulcers. These weren't just painful, they were chronic, open wounds in an era with zero understanding of hygiene. The risk of infection, leading to sepsis, blood poisoning, was astronomical. Every time a surgeon scraped or lanced those sores with an unsterilized tool, he wasn't just treating the king. He was potentially delivering the fatal blow. A simple infection, spiraling out of control, could easily have finished him off. Suspect number 3, type 2 diabetes. While we can't diagnose him retrospectively, his symptoms, extreme obesity, the chronic ulcers that wouldn't heal, potential circulatory and kidney issues line up disturbingly well with modern descriptions of the disease. Untreated diabetes can lead to a cascade of organ failure. Henry might have been literally rotting from the inside out due to his own malfunctioning metabolism. Suspect number 4, gout. Another delightful consequence of his rich diet, causing agonizing joint pain and inflammation. While rarely fatal on its own, severe, chronic gout can contribute to kidney problems and overall systemic stress. Suspect number 5, general system failure. Kidneys, heart, liver? Take your pick. Decades of rich food, heavy drinking, possible syphilis, though debated, and the sheer physical stress of being Henry VIII likely took their toll on every major organ. It probably wasn't just one thing that failed. It was a total system collapse, a biological implosion years in the making. And let's not forget the accomplices, his own doctors. The constant bloodletting weakened him. The violent purges dehydrated him. The bizarre home remedies he concocted, possibly involving lead or mercury, might have added subtle poisoning to the mix. The brutal treatments for his ulcers invited infection. The final insult? The very people paid a fortune to save the king almost certainly hastened his end. Their cures were, in effect, just another set of symptoms. Congratulations, Henry. You paid the top medical minds in the country to help you die slightly faster and more painfully. So, what's the verdict? Without an autopsy, we'll never know for sure, but the most likely answer is all of the above. Henry VIII wasn't killed by a single dramatic illness. He was killed by being Henry VIII, by his appetites, his injuries, his lifestyle, and the profound medical ignorance of his age. It was a slow, multi-system failure, a grotesque implosion decades in the making. The great king didn't just die, he disintegrated. And so, the great King Henry VIII, the man who reshaped England with the force of his will and the size of his appetites, finally meets the one enemy neither his power nor his paranoia could defeat, his own body. His final days weren't a blaze of royal glory, but a slow, grotesque fade into oblivion, a spectacle of pain, pride, and spectacularly bad medicine. He spent his life projecting an image of almost divine power and vitality, yet his end reveals the pathetic, painful reality beneath the crown, a man ultimately consumed by his own appetites and the profound medical ignorance of his age. In the end, he divorced God, but couldn't divorce his own decaying body. A final, grim irony for the king who thought he could control everything. And with that final, slightly leaky image, our time with Henry VIII is over. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this quiet journey into the past, I hope you'll consider joining me again for another story. But for now, it's time to let the story go. Let the furious king, the scheming courtiers, and the well-intentioned but lethal doctors all fade away into silence. There are no more ulcers to lance, no more factions to appease. There is only this moment of peace and the gentle promise of sleep. Rest well. Good night. And so, the great King Henry VIII, the man who reshaped England with the force of his will and the size of his appetites, finally meets the one enemy neither his power nor his paranoia could defeat, his own body. His final days weren't a blaze of royal glory, but a slow, grotesque fade into oblivion, a spectacle of pain, pride, and spectacularly bad medicine. He spent his life projecting an image of almost divine power and vitality, yet his end reveals the pathetic, painful reality beneath the crown, a man ultimately consumed by his own appetites and the profound medical ignorance of his age. In the end, he divorced God, but couldn't divorce his own decaying body. A final, grim irony for the king who thought he could control everything. And with that final, slightly leaky image, Our time with Henry VIII is over. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this quiet journey into the past, I hope you'll consider joining me again for another story. But for now, it's time to let the story go. Let the furious king, the scheming courtiers, and the well-intentioned but lethal doctors all fade away into silence. There are no more ulcers to lance, no more factions to appease. There is only this moment of peace and the gentle promise of sleep. Rest well. Good night.